on the sidewalk leading to Annabelle. In September, I stood upon a raised platform a step above cobbled stone, and found myself sandwiched between the looming building of a 1700s Unitarian church and a newish brick box that held a storefront and dubiously called Roller Rabbit. There was a parallel in the two that I wouldn't think to contemplate until later, but at the moment escaped my attention, as I was only there by the whim of the tourist in me. The first time I met this particular chunk of cement, we were strangers, and I was just one face of many in a group of curious visitors. But that was before. That was on the breath of summer's fading kiss, my story and poem for it not yet born. But in that inhale, I was curious, I wanted to make sure I remembered, make sure I didn't forget. From where I stood, this street curb was a foyer, of sorts, and from this vantage point I stared straight on, settling my gaze on the famous wrought iron gate that faced an entrance into one of God's gardens. And you see, I wanted to soak it all in. I mean, what a cool thing, right? To hear a real story and visit where it happened holding it in mind. That's when the magic happens, when history comes alive. What else could make you feel closer to those ancient lives now buried as much in time as they are in the ground this curb protected? At least, that was my argument. The one I repeated to myself on the way, and the defense I presented to the sidewalk that held my weight before those everlasting gates. It didn't crumble beneath me, as I remember feeling it might. Just as it didn't seem to judge my intentions. It sat silently underfoot, steadfast and sturdy, as I offered to it nothing but my presence. In the months to come I would sit almost 3,000 miles away from that curb, and still be haunted by it. My feet would feel like I never left, the pressure of standing on that uneven cracked pavement would press against my toes, and without thinking I would summon the photo of the graveyard entrance onto my phone just to stare at its vantage point on the screen. I'd repeat the story in my mind, how beyond those gates were the 7 graves to a singular young lady buried a century ago. She was a young Southern woman who fell in love with a sailor just before the Civil War. Her powerful and wealthy father did not approve of this match, and did his best to keep them separated. When he found her secret wedding gown in her closet, and discovered her intentions to elope with the man, he used his influence to have him moved to a military post in a different state far away. It was in this time of distance that the young woman fell ill with the Spanish influenza, and she passed. When the sailor discovered this, he made plans to return to South Carolina and grieve his lost love at her grave. However, the father knew the sailor would do so, and out of spite he bought 6 grave plots in the Unitarian Cemetery of downtown Charleston. To this day no one knows which his daughter, the sailor's bride-to-be, was buried in. It's said that the woman's ghost still haunts the cemetery, donning the wedding dress she was buried in, mourning her short life and her inability to rest without saying goodbye to her lover. They say her name was Annabelle Lee, and the sailor's name was Edgar Allan Poe. I left that curb, but I fear the perspective it gave me never left me. On the 6-hour plane ride home, I sketched the gates from my sentinel stand from when I stood on its back, and from my apartment on the other side of the country I wrote about how the hanging Spanish moss, the tendrils of crabgrass, and the outstretched fingers of curling ivy beckoned me deeper. And after 5 months passed, I found myself greeting the slab of stone that still held my phantom footsteps from before. Unlike the first, this meeting was by the light of a winter moon, and it struck me that the earth's familiarity was with strangers. I felt the fresh press to insist that I was not one. Not really. It's funny how every time I return to Charleston I find myself gripped with the urge to defend my claim to it as my hometown. But it was unnecessary. As I raised myself onto its body, it was with a kind of respect that I didn't sense from it before. I approach differently now than I did then, and I have to say, there's just something about a Charlestonian moon. Especially that one, luminous and perfectly eerie in the still night I chose for my return. And I admitted, not only to myself, but aloud as if the ground beneath me needed to hear, if there's one thing I cannot argue, it's that this spot, this place on earth, for whatever reason follows me in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but return, and in doing so present my hopes that this time might be final. The gates in my fixated footprints might finally let me go. And the only thing I could think to do to stop it was to talk. No, to listen. To see if there was anything more that needed to be said. I tried reciting the poem I wrote during the months in between, but of course, no one answered. Not a thing. Were it still summer, I might have heard at least a cricket, some cicadas, but with the down season of tourism, not even the rubber crunch of wheels on asphalt could be heard. Turns out, I'm still listening. And my spot, where my shoes touch cement in anxious trepidation, still waits for my future visits. Because now I know there will always be more.